Hello, friends, and thank you for joining me on the Finding Elevation podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Thompson. I am a mountaineer. I've coached hundreds of aspiring mountain athletes to reach their goals. I also am the author of the book, Finding Elevation, Fear and Courage on the World's Most Dangerous Mountain. And I am super passionate about learning and growing through adventurous pursuits. That's why this podcast is dedicated to encouraging, uplifting, inspiring, and educating people like yourself who aspire to elevate their lives through the outdoors. So let's get into it. There's a moment on your approach to Dablam where you've been walking for days and you're somewhere around 14,000 feet in the Khumbu Valley, and you come around a corner. There's a beautiful stupa there. And Dablam just stops you. It dominates the skyline more than anything else. And it doesn't even look like a real mountain. To me, it looks like someone just drew it. There's this perfect, almost impossible pyramid that rises seemingly straight out of the valley, and these two beautiful ridges that spread out below the summit like arms, which is actually what the name means in the local language, and which is mother's necklace, because there's this hanging glacier between those ridges that extend like arms, and it looks like the jewelry that a mother would wear. And your first thought when you see Dablam, at least mine, was that this is the most beautiful mountain, most stunning mountain I've ever seen. And your second thought, if you're there to climb it, is how do people actually get up there and back safely? So that's what this episode is all about. Welcome to the Finding Elevation podcast. I'm Lisa Thompson, and this is the latest version of our Know Before You Go series, which we haven't actually talked about in a while. But today we're going to do a deep dive on Dablam, one of the most technically beautiful and aesthetically pleasing mountains to look at, I think. And also one of the most meaningful climbs that you can do, especially in a progression to bigger peaks. So if you've been eyeing this peak like I have, I've not yet climbed Amma, different story about planning it multiple times and it never actually coming together. But if you're just trying to figure out what the progression might look like, this episode is for you. If you're curious about what it takes to climb it, what the day-to-day is like, then stick around because that's what we're going to talk about. So let's get into it. Dablam is in Nepal. The summit is 6,812 meters, or about 22,350 feet. And it's in the Khumbu region, the same region where Everest is in Nepal. It's also one of the most photographed mountains in the world for good reason. Architecturally, aesthetically, it's really just an extraordinary looking peak. But here's what I want you to understand first, because I think this shapes everything about how you approach climbing a mountain like Amma. It is not in the same category as other 6,000 meter peaks in Nepal that people might use as stepping stones or progressive peaks. So I'm thinking about Mera Peak, about Island Peak, about Lobuche East. Those are wonderful, gorgeous mountains, and they're really a big part of what builds the foundation for getting to a peak like Amma. But they are fundamentally different objectives, even though they're at similar elevations as Dablam. So Mera, for example, is 6,400 meters, and it's a very beautiful, long, sustained glacial walk. It tests your altitude and your fitness and your endurance, but it does not test your technical rock and ice climbing skills like Dablam does. The Southwest Ridge, which is the standard route on Amma, involves multi-pitch rock climbing of between 5'6" and 5'9" in difficulty while you're wearing mountaineering boots, which is a whole other level of challenge. And you're doing it on a ridge that in places is barely wider than your shoulders, with thousands of feet of exposure on either side. There's also a section called the Yellow Tower, which is a near vertical rock wall that is technically the crux of the lower mountain. And above high camp, you're then on what's called the Mushroom Ridge, which is a knife edge arête that leads up to snow slopes that are anywhere between 50 and 70 degrees. And those snow slopes then are finally what takes you to the summit. So this is serious, sustained technical terrain. And I think that It's actually the most important thing to say about why people love this mountain is because it really rewards skill, not just fitness. It's going to require more than just suffering at altitude. It will ask for your full toolkit and skills as a mountaineer or a mountain athlete. And that includes being comfortable on rock. It includes ice. It includes rope systems and fixed line technique and travel. It requires managing altitude and moving efficiently as a team. And when you pull all of that together and stand on the summit, I think the satisfaction is different. I think it's much deeper when you've really had to pull from all of your resources and all of your skills in order to accomplish something, especially when you do it as a team. The climbers who I've worked with who've climbed AMA describe it as one of the most complete mountaineering experiences they've had. If you're from the Pacific Northwest in the US like I am, I hear a lot of people say that about Shuxen as well, which is an alpine peak here. And Ama Dablam is just, multitudes more of each of those components than Shuxen is. It always strikes me how people feel so rewarded after they summit Ama because it really took, all the tools that they had at their disposal to get up there and back safely. It's also worth knowing where this mountain sits in the broader Himalayan ecosystem. The Khumbu Valley is, one of the most spectacular and accessible high altitude regions on Earth, probably. And the approach to Ama Dablam takes you through those same villages that you'll walk through on your way to Everest or Everest Base Camp. So Namche Bazaar, which is the biggest village, you'll go past the Tangboche Monastery, through all of that, spectacular terrain that the local Sherpa have traveled for centuries and that we as mountain athletes have traversed for decades. And so that sort of cultural experience and richness is a big part for me of why I climb. And I want to just point out that, by climbing Ama, you get to experience some of that as well. You get to experience the Sherpa community, the monasteries, the way of life for, the people who've lived there for centuries. So it's not just a climbing trip. I hope people think of it more broadly than that because it's really a chance to be immersed in an incredible culture that's very rewarding just by itself. And this is something that I always tell climbers who are thinking about their first big Himalayan objective, that the mountain is part of it, an important part of it, and what we spend most of our times thinking about and preparing for, but the culture and the place where that mountain resides is a part of the experience and really adds to what we learn and how we grow from mountain pursuits. So give yourself time to actually be there in this beautiful terrain and to learn from it. Okay, that's a little bit of background. So who is this mountain for? I want to spend some time on this because I think that this is where a lot of people, I've seen people either undersell themselves or oversell themselves. And I think both have the potential to create some problems. So let me describe the climber first who is ready for Ama Dablam. So if you have been climbing consistently for several years, not occasionally, but like consistently, and you've got real alpine experience, meaning that you've been on glaciated terrain, you've moved successfully on rope teams, you're confident with crevasse rescue, you're comfortable with steep terrain and crampons and ice axes, and add to that you've done some technical rock work as well. And climbing gyms are fantastic and I love them. And, they teach us a lot, but I'm talking here not about sport climbing, but really about trad climbing or alpine rock that's multi-pitch, where you've actually had to navigate real rock terrain with a pack while wearing mountaineering boots. You should be comfortable, I would say up to 5'9" in those conditions with 20-pound backpack. Add to that you've also been at altitude and not necessarily above 7,000 meters, but that you've had meaningful high altitude experience and you've performed well and you know how your body responds. I would say that's as important as performing well at elevation, that you know how you acclimate normally, how your body responds to the stress of altitude. And you've spent time above, I'd say 5,000 meters, and you've managed yourself well and been able to move efficiently and contribute to your team in that environment. And then finally, the thing to think about, and this I think is one of the less talked about but really important things to consider, is that you've developed some mental strength and discernment. So you've been in situations on mountains where things got uncomfortable or uncertain or scary or didn't go according to plan. And you had to manage that internal noise and still keep moving well. So to me, that is the climber who's ready, has had all of that experience and done all those things and learned from them. So let's contrast that with the climber who is not yet ready for Ama Dablam. And I say this full of respect because we were all here at some point in our progression. And I think it's really important to remember that. But if your highest summit is something like Kilimanjaro, even though that's high elevation, it's not technical in nature. If you haven't yet done sustained technical rock and ice in alpine conditions, then Ama Dablam is going to ask more of you than you have right now. And that doesn't mean that it's not in your future. It just means that you need another year or two of very deliberate technical progression on other peaks in order to be ready for Ama Dablam and everything that it will demand at you. If you have climbed, when we all started here, Rainier, Baker, and then probably progressed to Denali, those build real readiness. If you've also climbed in the Alps on alpine rock, if you've been on an expedition like Denali or Aconcagua, and you've done a combination of technical alpine courses plus some high altitude experience, then you're likely in the right zone and worth really evaluating individually if this is something that's on your radar. And of course, I'd be happy to help you do that. But I really want to be honest about something here because I think that the guiding industry doesn't always say this clearly. The technical filtering on Ama Dablam matters for safety reasons. And that's not unique to Ama Dablam. It's not just about performance or success, but it's really about safety. And so on Ama specifically, the Yellow Tower, the Mushroom Ridge are not places where you want to be figuring out fixed lying technique for the first time, nor do you want someone on your team to be figuring that out for the first time. They're not places where you want to be managing a crampon issue at altitude and steep terrain in the dark. The margin for error is smaller, I think, when there's this technical detail to climbing, and that's true on Ama and not true on others, 7 or 6,500 meter peaks in the Himalaya. And that's not a reason to be afraid of it, but it's a reason to be honest with yourself about where you are in your progression and to make sure that you and everyone else on your team arrives genuinely ready for all of the challenges. In my experience, the climbers who have the best time on Ama Dablam, the ones who summit and who come back gaining something and also contributing something positively to their team, are the ones who showed up prepared, not just fit. Fit is a part of prepared, but prepared is being ready with the right skill, having their gear dialed, being mentally ready, having studied the route. So having all of those things come together, to me, is what really makes you ready for a peak like Ama Dablam. I also noticed that climbers on Ama age-wise tend to skew a little bit higher, and I think that's not by accident. I think this mountain tends to attract people who've been building towards it, who've been doing the right technical progression and been putting in the time, and who have the resources and the life situation too to commit to a 30-plus day expedition. So if that's where you are, then that's exactly the right time for us to be having this conversation. So let's walk through the route itself. This is all about what to expect. So let's start with the route, because I think understanding the terrain helps you prepare in a much more targeted way. So the Southwest Ridge is the standard route on Ama Dablam, and it's the one that most guided expeditions use, maybe all guided expeditions use. There are other routes, beautiful routes on the mountain like the Northeast Ridge, but for our purposes in this conversation, we'll talk about the Southwest Ridge. So this approach follows, as I said, kind of the classic Everest base camp trek for a significant portion, multiple days, which means that you're starting in Lukla. You'll fly to Lukla, and then you'll start walking first through Phakding and then Namche and then Tangboche. And from there, most people will branch off towards Ama Dablam Base Camp, which is at 45, almost 4,600 meters. And the approach alone, this trekking portion, takes 5 days, maybe a little bit longer, depending on your acclimatization itinerary and weather conditions and, flights and logistics. But I want to pause here for a second on acclimatization, because your plan is genuinely the most important thing that I want to talk about in this episode. And so I'm going to come back to it in depth in the next segment, because there's this trend, I think, towards doing things quickly. And I don't want to discourage people from doing that, because I understand the draw, but I think there are downsides, especially if you're not prepared, to trying to do a flash expedition. So we'll come back to acclimatization in a minute. So once you get to base camp on Dablam, the route goes, as the name suggests, a southwest ridge. And there are sort of three segments of the route that are pretty clearly delineated by camps. Camp 1 is at 5,700 meters. And the route to get there involves some straightforward but increasingly steep terrains, a rocky ridgeline, some scrambling. And you're starting between base camp and camp 1 to really get into the character, I think, of the mountain. This section sort of gives you a little precursor into what is coming. The fixed lines also begin here. I can't stress this enough. You need to be efficient and comfortable on them, not tentative, not struggling, not taking 30 seconds to pass by an anchor. You really need to be able to move efficiently, not just for your own safety, but because everything that you do impacts the people on those fixed lines behind you. And so if you're struggling to get your ascender locked and loaded or to pass an anchor, that affects everyone behind you. So once you get to camp 1, you'll probably spend a night there. You may, depending again on your acclimatization plan, you may go back to base camp to give yourself more time to acclimatize. But between camp 1 and camp 2, this is where you meet the Yellow Tower. Camp 2 is at just about 6,000 meters. And the terrain between these two camps is definitely the most technical on the lower part of the mountain. The Yellow Tower is, as the name suggests, a vertical rock section that's about 5'8". In the summer, it would be dry rock, but you need to be making really deliberate, confident moves on this tower because you're wearing mountaineering boots, managing a heavy pack, and your body is probably not acclimated, at least the first time that you climb it. So this is the section where that technical preparation that would have happened on other peaks really shows. Camp 2 itself, we've probably all seen these, incredible, unbelievable photos of Camp 2 on Dablam. It's a pretty wild place to spend the night because you're on this just unbelievably narrow ridge, and tents are basically stacked on top of one another and sort of hanging off the edge of the mountain. It's one of those places where if you take a step outside your tent, you're suddenly very aware of where you are and what the risks are. And, of course, just stunning views from that elevation on Amma. Once you ascend above Camp 2, things start to shift. The terrain starts to shift. So the Yellow Tower is now behind you, and you're heading into more icy and snowy terrain that really defines the upper mountain. If you're like me, this is where you sort of get excited about steep snow. The rock stuff is fun and engaging, and it helps, my body moves in a different way, and I think differently about my physicality on rock, but my comfort zone is really on steep snow. And so I'm always a little bit excited to get to that part of an alpine peak because it means I get to just sort of not rest, but I don't know, it's definitely where I'm more comfortable. So on Amma, there's no Camp 3 in a traditional sense. Some people will make a secondary camp. There's been some avalanches there, and so there's debate about whether it makes sense to camp above Camp 2. And more often, I'm seeing teams that will start their summit push from Camp 2. The Mushroom Ridge is in this section. That can sometimes get into people's heads. It's definitely, we'll talk about mental resiliency and preparation in a minute, but the Mushroom Ridge is this spectacular knife edge traverse. And the ridge is so narrow in places that you're really, having to put one foot directly in front of another with a lot of exposure on both sides, and is totally a mental game. There's nothing technical about how you're moving on this ridge. You need to manage a decently sized backpack and make sure you're moving efficiently, but you're really just walking. And so it takes, I think, especially if you get a little sketched out by exposure, it's worth spending the time to spend time getting exposed and being on other peaks where the consequences are lower, but also thinking about what's going on mentally when exposure becomes challenging for us, because it's really our brain trying to tell us that something is unsafe. And often that comes with a little bit of unknown. And so being able to take the challenge associated with that terrain and use that as fuel to build confidence and move efficiently is really the key when we're in these situations where our brain is telling us that something is wrong, and we know that we really have the skill and experience to navigate that kind of terrain. So after the Mushroom Ridge, you then hit ice slopes that lead to the summit. Again, those are, probably sustained 60 degrees, and there will be fixed lines here. So this is physically demanding and also, I think, mentally demanding because you're exhausted or, above 68 or 500 meters and having to manage sort of all of those things at once to get to the summit. There's definitely some stress when you get that close to the summit. Turning around, as we all know, it's more challenging the closer you get. And then finally, the summit, again, 6812 meters. If you're there on a nice day, we'll have just expansive views of the Himalaya. You'll be looking directly at Everest. You can see Lhotse off to the side and Nuptse, and you'll be able to see, if it's clear enough, the Khumbu icefall. So this is the kind of view that, makes everything you've done to get to that point really feel worthwhile. So that's the route. A few things about conditions and timing that matter a lot. If you've studied climbing in the Himalaya at all, you know that there are two main climbing seasons, and that's true for Ama Dablam as well. There's pre-monsoon, which is April through May, and then post-monsoon, which is in the autumn, usually October through November. The autumn season in particular is known for better conditions on Ama Dablam. The weather is a little more stable, but the cold can really be detrimental. So timing it just right, I think. The last Ama Dablam trip that I organized, we planned to leave like the second week of October and to be off the mountain by the middle of November. That's when weather is stable, but you've got to be ready for some pretty cold temperatures. However, the strongest Ama Dablam success rates typically occur in the autumn. There's one caveat though, and this is important for any mountain, and that is that we have to pay attention to the weather. So you can have the perfect team, the perfect preparation, the perfect gear and acclimatization, all those things, and still be held at camp for multiple days by a storm. We saw that happen last year in 2025, where a really big storm moved through in the autumn through the Himalaya and dumped a bunch of snow, and it caused teams to spend more time than they had anticipated at whatever camp they happened to be at. So this is why expedition length matters so much, because a 21-day expedition gives you very little buffer. And it's heartbreaking to me to see someone say, I can't wait out the weather because I have to be back for, a commitment at work or whatever it is. I think it's much smarter to give yourself the full range of time that you think an expedition could take, so that you've got the freedom and the luxury really to wait out those weather windows or wait out a GI bug or make sure that you acclimatize appropriately. So we at Mountain Madness plan for 36 days for that reason, because it gives you that buffer. And you could argue that, those weather days are wasted days, but they're built into the plan for a reason, and there's still time that you're spent acclimatizing, which brings me to the next most important point. And I want to spend some real time here, because I think that acclimatization strategy is one of the most misunderstood factors in an expedition, and misunderstood because I see so many people want to shortcut it. And again, I understand the draw of that, but I think that you're missing out on some things if you try to rush your way through a Himalayan expedition. And I think acclimatization is also such a big determinant of success in the mountains. So here's something that I hear a lot as a coach. I will hear it like, I've been to altitude before. I know how my body responds. I will be fine. I'm going to shorten my expedition. And sometimes that is true. And sometimes it works out great. But I would say on the balance, it doesn't, because acclimatization is not just about whether you've been at altitude before. It's about whether your current arrival on that mountain in that season at that specific altitude progression is enough, and whether it set you up to perform at the technical cruxes that you'll experience on AMA, which are all above 6,000 meters. I've been reading some interesting research as well about acclimatization, which says that, it may be related to the health of your gut. And I think there's still research to be done there, but it certainly supports what I've seen in the mountains personally and with other people that you can be on the same mountain, with the same level of training and acclimatize at the same rate. And you may have, extreme symptoms of AMS one year and you may not the following year. And so there's definitely something at play there that is variable, and it very much could be our health or our gut. So more to be said there. But the point is that just because you've been at that elevation before doesn't necessarily mean that you know how you're going to perform in terms of acclimatization this time. Ama Dablam is climbed by most people the same style as other Himalayan peaks, meaning that there's this important principle of climbing high and sleeping low. And the idea there is that you repeatedly expose yourself to higher altitude during the day by climbing higher, and then you descend to sleep, which triggers your body's adaptive responses of, producing more red blood cells and being more efficient about oxygen utilization. And that is what allows you to, and also getting used to the change in pressure. And that is what allows you to acclimatize and then be ready to climb successively higher. So on Ama Dablam, that typically means spending a significant amount of time in the 5 to 1,000 meter range before you push to the summit. And teams have various ways of doing that, whether it's rotations on the mountain or whether it's acclimatizing on a different, less technical mountain. But getting that foundation is a really important step, I think, in being ready for success on the mountain that you came there to climb. And so this is why I think the idea of summiting another peak before Ama, like Lobuche East, becomes really important. So Lobuche is 6,100 meters. So it's meaningfully above Ama Dablam Base Camp elevation, and it's significantly above Everett Base Camp trekking altitude. And it involves real technical terrain, a steep head wall, moving efficiently in crampons. There's some exposure on a ridge. So it gives you both, I think, physiological adaptation and a little technical warm up at the same time. I like the idea of including Lobuche East or even Island Peak into an Ama Dablam itinerary because it's much more than just padding. I think it's the thing that makes the rest of the expedition really come together. And you arrive at Ama Dablam Base Camp having already been above 6,000 meters. So your body has already started that acclimatization adaptation process that it needs. And then when you start moving up the Southwest Ridge, you're not learning what altitude feels like or remembering what altitude feels like at 5,700 meters. You already know because you've been spending multiple days, maybe a week above 5,000 meters all the way up to 6,100 meters, and you're ready. So really encourage people to consider acclimatizing on, I think Lobuche is probably the best option, but Island Peak is another good one as well. And if you acclimatize on Island Peak, you get to see a different part of the Khumbu Valley. But the point is that, having that time at a higher elevation is going to set you up for success on the mountain that you came there to climb. I also want to share a particular failure pattern that I see on mountains like this, which is a really aggressive timeline. And I've talked about it a little bit before. And there's definitely a trend in, guided mountaineering towards shorter and shorter expeditions. And I'm not against them. I'm not their biggest fan either, for multiple reasons. I think that even shorter time on other peaks with some pre-acclimatization tools. As I said, I understand the appeal. Most people who climb Ama Dablam have, families and demanding careers, finite amount of vacation time, and 36 days is a big commitment for sure. But here's the trade-off. A shorter timeline compresses your acclimatization windows. That's usually how we get to a shorter timeline, which means it reduces your weather buffer and asks your body to adapt faster than for some people is physiologically comfortable. And you can push through that a little bit with fitness and definitely with some luck, but the margin for error gets much thinner. And I think you have to be ready to accept that. The other thing that I think is missed by speedy expeditions is that you will often totally eliminate the trek to base camp. And, that can be justified if you're, say, acclimatizing using a hypoxico system. And we've talked about that on other episodes and how it's not a perfect match for actually being at elevation because it can't simulate pressure, the drop in pressure. But you're also missing this beautiful cultural experience and being in, if you're a mountain athlete, what is one of the most iconic and stunning places to be in the world. And you're missing out on just really immersing yourself in that culture and getting to know the people and their food and their families and what their days are like and how they grew up. And so for me, and I know, not everyone is like this, cutting that trek or even the walk out after the summit attempt, cutting that out of the itinerary really, really is a missed opportunity. And, I will tell people that I coach that you might not ever have a chance to go back there. And so why would you want to miss this really beautiful experience that you have that I think pays more reverence to the mountain if you really immerse yourself in that culture before you go? So the teams and the people that I have seen come off Ama Dablam the most satisfied, whether they summited or not, are the ones who gave the mountain enough time. And I would say personally, the time that it demands that kind of respect of your time. They didn't have to feel like they were racing. They had days in the itinerary that were genuinely for rest and adaptation and not just for, checking boxes on an acclimatization schedule. So you're already making a significant investment in doing this. And I think giving yourself the best possible chance by doing it with enough time built in is really key. So I'll get off my acclimatization soapbox now. So let's shift a little bit to talking about gear and training, my favorite subject. So I want to chat about what you actually need to show up with, both in your backpack and, in terms of fitness, both mentally and physically, to be ready for a peak like Ama. I'll break this down into a couple of parts, training and then gear. And I'll be specific because I think vague advice like you have to be the fittest you've ever been in your life, make sure you understand how to layer, just really isn't super useful for people. So let's start with physical preparation. And I want to begin with sort of a reframe here, because most people, I think, when they think about training for Himalayan expedition, default to cardio. And I have this conversation with mountain athletes probably every week that, and I fall into the same category. I feel like I'm recovering from this type of thinking, but they default to cardio and want to spend all their time, usually outside running or hiking and not spend time in the gym. And that stuff matters. It absolutely matters. But on a mountain like Ama Dablam, it's only part of the picture. I think the more important question is, how is your technical climbing fitness? Because by the time you're on the Yellow Tower and you're at 5,800 meters and you've got a heavy pack, you are probably not thinking about aerobic capacity. You are thinking about footwork. You're thinking about hand placements. You're thinking about your body placement and balance on steep rock. And if those things are automatic, if your technique is so ingrained by experience, then your brain has the bandwidth left to manage altitude, exposure, fatigue, hunger, fear. But by contrast, if your technique is effortful, if you're not moving efficiently, if you're struggling to climb steep rock in mountaineering boots, you're having to consciously then think through every move on steep terrain and then at altitude, and it just becomes so much more difficult than it has to be. So if you're in a preparation phase for Ama Dablam this fall, I want you to really build technical climbing time. And I want that to be on rock. And, most of us have that relatively accessible to us now, but if not, it may mean that you have to travel to get to it. But really think about some multi-pitch trad climbing. You don't have to lead it. You can be guided. The point is, though, that you're getting on routes that push you to the 5-9 range with a pack. And then once you're comfortable with mountaineering boots on, at a minimum approach shoes, but if you can get out on some rock in boots, it's going to make all the difference because it is a game changer. I love also the idea, and this is where I think a guide comes in, of doing it in conditions that aren't perfect. Still safe, of course, but when I was training for K2, I really made an effort to climb in, shitty weather, in cold conditions, in rain, in wind, to do early starts. The point is that you're building automatic competence as opposed to just, saying that you can climb a specific sport grade, that you're really in the mountains, experiencing all of those things and being competent and adding to your skill and your efficiency. On the aerobic side, though, let's not forget that. You've definitely heard me say this before, that Zone 2 endurance really is the foundation. Those long, sustained, moderate intensity, but high volume efforts that should be at a conversational pace. So thinking, long hikes with elevation gain. Rucking has become popular, at least in the US lately. So that works too with a weighted backpack. Long runs, if that's your thing. I think For some of us, cycling can also be an option. You want your aerobic base to be so solid that sustained uphill movement feels like meditative. It doesn't feel effortful, and you're able to move efficiently and calmly, because on summit day on Ama Dablam, you'll be moving for a very long time and you need your aerobic system to be operating efficiently. So let's not forget strength. I started talking about that in the beginning of this section, that most mountain athletes want to be in the mountains. That's why we do this. And we will often prioritize that over strength training in the gym. And I have been this way for many years. I've since starting to prioritize strength differently because, and I'll, again, say this to athletes all the time, that if you spend time putting in the right kind of strength effort in the gym, it will absolutely improve your game when you are outside. When that finally clicked for me, and I've seen this click for other mountain athletes too, when they finally realized that, it's not where we want to be. I'd much rather be outside running in the rain than working out in a gym. But that gym time absolutely affects how I'm able to move and perform when I'm in the mountains. And so from that perspective, it is absolutely worthwhile. We've talked about this on other episodes of the podcast, but you specifically want to focus on posterior chain movements and strength building. And I think doing single leg work is important as well. So things like step ups with weight or Bulgarian split squats, Romanian deadlifts. The climbing on Ama Dablam is not flat. So you're going to be up for hours at a time. The muscular endurance in your legs and hips is what is going to keep your technique clean when you're tired. I notice that even if I'm on a run, that if I'm starting to shuffle my feet or snag a shoe on something, it usually is a sign, A, that I'm tired, and B, that I need to focus on building my endurance so that I have the endurance that I need when everything else gets tired. I also want to talk about breath work because this is, become for me very important. And I've seen through working with Anthony LaRubio, who you've heard interviewed on this podcast, I have really seen the benefit of having solid breathwork tools for the mountains, and things like box breathing, like doing a sharp exhale to clear CO2 out of your lungs. Those make such a big difference, both in terms of practices to prepare for the mountain and in terms of how you can help manage your breath when you're on the mountain. So highly recommend that. I think, doing that in the months before your expedition really improves your altitude tolerance and your ability to stay calm in high stress situations on the mountain. And I am biased here, but I don't think that this is a fringe idea anymore. I think that it's something that is a game changer that I'm seeing more and more mountain athletes work into their toolkit. So a comment too on pre-acclimatization. I, have a hypoxico system. I have used it for probably more than a decade off and on to prepare for different climbs. And if you have access to an altitude tent, I think it is worth using. I don't think it is necessary, especially if you're following my advice and, following a very conservative acclimatization schedule. The caveat in using some sort of pre-acclimatization tent or system is that if you're sleeping in it, you must make sure that you are still getting enough rest and recovery. I had a call yesterday with an athlete who's getting ready to leave for Everest, and he's been sleeping in a tent for 6 weeks probably. And he's, 2 weeks to go before Everest, and he's just so tired of sleeping in that tent. And I totally get it because it is not comfortable. And the risk is that you are not rested enough to in a meaningful way in the rest of your life, but also you're not rested or recovered enough to get the most out of whatever your training plan is. It's a run or a weighted carry for the day after you slept in the tent. And so just really threading, a very narrow needle there of trying to get the most out of it without adding any more unnecessary stress to your system. I also recommend giving yourself a lot of time in the tent, which again, referencing the athlete who's getting ready to leave for Everest, can be rough, but it gives you the time to take a day off from sleeping in it once a week. It gives you the time to travel. It gives you, if you get sick, you shouldn't be sleeping in it. So having a really long runway helps make sure that you're able to get through those periods, and it still improves your red blood cell count and, sets you up to have a real positive benefit when you get to the mountain. So, and we could talk more about hypoxico, but that's all I'll say for now. But let me shift to gear in the time that we have left. So I want to talk through just categories that matter the most. It's not an exhaustive list, but the things that I think are specific to Ama Dablam where I see people show up underprepared. So the really big one here, I think, is boots. This mountain requires, I think, especially if you're climbing in the fall, a double boot. If your feet run hot, you could probably get by with a single boot, but I would have some sort of backup plan in case your feet are colder than you expect them to be. I've seen, and I've fallen prey to this too, wanted to take the lightest boots I possibly could because they're lighter and they're more nimble, and then end up with cold toes. And I've seen that, be ultimately what turns people around. I think it's a very avoidable problem. And if you're practicing in those double boots on other peaks, or if your climbing gym allows you to wear them, they're not fun to wear rock climbing, but you can get to the point of being efficient and confident while you're moving in them. Obviously, for a boot you're bringing to Ama Dablam, I think you should have many, many hours working with it, getting to know it before you show up to that base camp. Boots that are broken in and familiar, I think, are radically different from new boots at altitude. And, blisters and foot issues at 5,800 or 6,000 meters are not a small problem anymore. They're the end of your expedition. So for crampons, I really like using technical crampons, so 12 points with front points. I've seen people use non-technical crampons, and I think that the ice slopes above Camp 2 are, potentially require some front pointing. And a general mountaineering crampon is not going to be as easy to use when you're on steep ice. So not absolutely essential, but I think having more technical crampons will be more beneficial for you. Obviously, you need a harness, you need an ascender. You will spend a significant amount of time on fixed lines, on fixed ropes on Ama Dablam. And so your jumaring technique needs to be super solid. Practice it, practice clipping and unclipping and reclipping, practice doing it with gloves on, practice doing it in the dark, practice doing it when your hands are cold. All of those things will make a difference and mean that you can move efficiently. And again, it doesn't just impact you, but it affects your team and everyone behind you as well. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. So layering, this is a skill I've decided. Layering is not just like something we randomly do. I've realized that it is a skill that we develop over time. And especially on big peaks like this, where it's going to be cold and below zero, but your movement is going to be aerobic. It can be challenging to manage layering in a way that's beneficial. If you're going to Ama in the fall, which chances are you are, it will be cold, not Denali cold or Vincent cold, but genuinely cold, especially on the upper mountain and especially on summit night. I think it's reasonable to wear a down suit, or at a minimum wear Feathered Friends is a store in Seattle that I love that makes down gear, and they cut a down suit into two different pieces. So you can buy the pants and you can buy the parka separately. I think that's a good option for peaks like Ama Dablam as well, because it gives you some more flexibility. But really, you need a down suit. I think I know multiple people who didn't have one, who got high on the mountain and had the skill and fitness and, mental fortitude to continue, but had to turn around just because they were cold. And so don't try to engineer that from lighter layers. Actually get a down suit. You'll appreciate it. Layering below that down suit, I think, is again where sort of discernment comes up, and, having experience and knowing how your body reacts, especially in aerobic conditions in cold environments, is important. I will typically wear just a one-piece fleece suit under my down suit and maybe a down jacket on top of that. And on Ama Dablam, because it's not going to be like, Denali cold, I think you could get away with like, standard sort of wool layers, top and bottom, and then a down suit on top of that. But the important thing is that you know your body and how you respond at altitude in aerobic conditions, and you're able to mix and match and layer appropriately so that you can stay warm, but not so warm that, sweating more than you need to be and losing electrolytes that need to be replenished. Also talk about your sleeping system. So you'll probably have 2 sleeping bags on Ama Dablam, similar to other Himalayan peaks. You'll leave one at base camp, and that one can be rated to maybe 0 or -10. And then you'll take another sleeping bag, probably just as high as Camp 2, unless you choose to make a Camp 3. But that heavier bag that you take higher, I think should be -40. It's always a trade-off because the warmer your bag is, the heavier it is. But if you take a super light bag, you're probably not going to sleep well, which means you're not going to recover, which means you're not going to perform as well. So a sleeping bag to me is something that I will err on the side of getting something that's a little heavier, because it means that I'm going to get a better night's sleep and my performance then will be stronger the next day. I don't think that sleeping bags are, a gear category you can really economize on, but I've seen many people doing it. And so it's, a trade-off that you have to be yourself comfortable with. The other thing that I'll talk about is gloves. So you're obviously doing, you're using an ascender or you're scrambling or doing technical rock climbing in a cold environment. So making sure that you have gloves that are warm enough, that allow you to, stay warm and therefore keep your fingers nimble, but are not so warm and bulky that you can't use your ascender or you can't really feel the rock if you're climbing. This is an area where I would really spend some time getting things dialed in on other mountains. I really like using Hestra gloves. I think that they're very warm, and I like the lobster claw version because it works well with an ascender. They're leather. It gives me enough dexterity that I can still use my ascender. They're not great for rock climbing because they're a mitten. And so for rock climbing, lately I've been using some Black Diamond gloves that I really like. I would have a couple pairs of them in case the conditions are snowy and those gloves get wet and you want to be able to take the wet ones off, put them, maybe close to your body, like in your armpits, so that they dry out, and then put a dry pair on. And then if it's really sustained wet conditions, you can then start to alternate, a glove, hopefully drier glove for one that's not as dry. So one final gear note that I think is underappreciated, and that is that your base camp kit matters more than people realize. You're going to spend a lot of days at base camp, weather days, rest days, acclimatization days, rotation days. And so having a comfortable, warm, and functional base camp setup with a good sleeping pad, which chances are your outfitter will provide you a nice thick mattress, but a solid tent, warm layers for camp, some comfort items, like I will usually bring a pair of jeans or like a comfy pair of flannel pants or something. I think those things really direct your morale and also your recovery. And I think a lot of people treat that base camp gear sort of as an afterthought, but you don't have to be miserable and still walking around in dirty climbing clothes when you're at base camp. So something to consider. Shifting now to the mental game. And I always say this because I think it's very true. That is that 80% of what happens on a major mountain happens above the shoulders. Our mindset and our mental resilience is just so important in the mountains, and on Dablam specifically. There are a few mental challenges that I think are distinct to that mountain and worth naming clearly so you can start working with them before you leave. Obviously, I'm passionate about this and have put together a program called Peak Performance that helps you work through some of these things. And whether you follow that or something else, I think don't skimp on thinking about your mental game before a big climb like Dablam. And for Amma, probably the thing that gets people the most, I think, is exposure. This is an exposed mountain. The ridge is narrow. The drops are significant. The visual reality of where you are is right there. You can't not see it. And so for climbers who are accustomed to big, wide glaciers and broad snow slopes, this can be an adjustment. The Mushroom Ridge in particular can activate vertigo for people. I've seen that happen, or anxiety if you don't normally experience that kind of exposure. It's important to remember that those kind of reactions are not flaws. That's a normal human response to being on a narrow knife-edged ridge at 6,500 meters when you're hypoxic. But it helps if you've worked on your relationship with exposure before you get there. The second challenge for people, and I think this is often overlooked, is patience. Any mountain will ask you to wait. There will be weather days, rotation days. You might be sick. The team may just be exhausted and need to rest and let, altitude adaptation continue. And in our culture, waiting can feel like a failure because you don't feel like you're progressing. You don't feel like you're moving forward. You don't feel like you're doing anything. And it is so key to reframe that because waiting, when it's intentional and strategic, is one of the most important skills you can bring to a Himalayan expedition. And teams that summit are often the teams that were willing to sit in base camp for 3 days while a weather system moved through, or while their team got 100% healthy or got rested, and then they were able to move when conditions were right. I've seen so many people try to rush things, just because they were impatient or didn't want to wait. So the third thing that I'll mention about your mental game is summit day itself. And when you're on that ridge leading to the summit and you're tired and your legs are heavy and there's more mountain above you, it's very common for that internal voice to say that, to question whether this is worth it, or whether you should turn around, or to question whether you can do this. And that voice can get pretty loud. And the answer is not to silence it. The answer is to acknowledge it, to keep it in perspective, and to work with it while you keep moving. I am a huge fan of breaking problems down into little micro segments. And so sometimes that means not thinking about the summit, but thinking about the next rope length and the one after that, and just, gradually piecing together what you need to be confident and successful in the mountains. So what I will leave you with is that all of this is trainable. Breath work, visualization, consistent exposure, and discomfort training, those are not soft skills. They're technical skills within the realm of mental preparation, and they're just as important as anything that you do in the gym or outside in the mountains to prepare for a peak like Dablam. So let me close out the practical section with a realistic picture of what a well-run Dablam expedition looks like, the logistics, the support structure, and what you should be looking for when you're evaluating your options. As I said, the expedition duration, I think, should be closer to 35 days. This gives you a chance to acclimatize on another 6,000 meter peak that's not as technical first. And it allows for comfortable rotation days on Dablam, which gives you a meaningful weather buffer, which gives you, chances to wait out weather for a summit. Any less than that, and I think you're potentially compromising and compressing the margins, which can be dangerous. On the support side, because I want to be direct about what differentiates a serious guided expedition from a cheaper option. And the thing that I think matters most is the amount of leadership and experience on the mountain, the awareness of that peak and how it's climbed and what its nuances are and how to move and plan efficiently. And the other thing that matters also is the ratio of support, usually from the Sherpa team, to climbers, especially on the technical sections. And so that, to me, that ratio should be 1-to-1 on places like the Ridge and the Yellow Tower, and even on the summit slopes. So, you've got a dedicated guide or Sherpa that's climbing with you. I don't think that that's a luxury anymore. I think that that's built-in safety. And on technical terrain at altitude, having someone with you who has deep experience of that mountain and local knowledge, having them side by side moving with you changes the calculus significantly. I will say that team size matters too. I am not a fan of giant teams, especially on technical peaks. And to me, a team of 5 or 6 climbers is fundamentally different from a team of 12 to 15. I think that smaller teams move better on technical terrain. I think they acclimatize more coherently. They have more flexibility in their scheduling, and they just create a more cohesive group dynamic over the 5 weeks that you'll be on the expedition. My experience has been that big teams on narrow ridges create bottlenecks. They create decision-making challenges that small teams just simply don't face. That doesn't mean that you won't experience those larger teams on a mountain like Dablam, but I think as a guide company owner, I think it's important that we're building the kind of aesthetic that we want to see in the mountains and that allows us to all enjoy those spaces in a responsible way. So what you should be asking any expedition guide company are things like, what is your guide to client ratio on the mountain, and in particular on technical sections or the cruxes of that particular route? I would want to know how long an itinerary is and what the acclimatization schedule is like. As I said, team size is really important. I'd like to know also about rest days and like if there's a forced rest period, what does that actually look like in the field? What is your approach as a leader when that happens? I think it's super important to know who's actually leading the expedition, who's climbing, who's going to be on the upper mountain, and what their specific Ama Dablam or Himalayan experience is. So those are the questions will tell you a lot, I think, about whether an operator is serious and doing it well, and whether, you will have your own answers to those questions. And so making sure that the guide company you choose to work with is aligned in the answers to those questions with you. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. It's about finding a fit for you that is consistent with how you want to climb the mountain. Ama Dablam is one of those peaks that really has the potential to change people. I've seen it happen. And climbers who arrive capable and left different, more capable and certain of themselves, a little more clear-eyed about what they're capable of, personally as well as in the mountains. I've seen Ama really become a reference point for doing something harder than they have before and using that to propel people to do something even more challenging in the future, because it's not an easy mountain. And that's exactly why it pushes us and gives us opportunities to grow and evolve. So if you're in the preparation phase right now and you're building that technical base, you're accumulating altitude experience and thinking about when and how you might make this attempt, I want you to be thinking about it clearly and honestly, not just can I summit, but am I building toward this in the right way? Going back again to what preparation really means. I think that the right progression typically looks like solid technical alpine experience in the Alps or in the Pacific Northwest, some really meaningful time at altitude on other peaks in the Himalaya or like Denali. I think even Aconcagua is good for just gaining elevation. Really an equivalent and solid commitment to doing the work to build your mental resilience ahead of time, to focus on more than just being physically prepared. So if you are somewhere in that progression and you want to think through where you stand, I love having these conversations. Happy to chat with you about that. At Mountain Madness, we've put together like a readiness protocol that we're starting to use more broadly. And I'd be happy to walk through that with you just to see sort of where you land. And we can put that protocol in the show notes so that you can walk through it on your own. So if you're at the stage where you're seriously evaluating an expedition, we at Mountain Madness are running a small team for the autumn of 2026, October 4th through November 6th, maximum of 6 climbers, 1-to-1 Sherpa ratio, very generous itinerary that includes a summit of Lobuche East. And if you feel like that's the next step in your progression, I would love to chat more. Those details are also in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We went a little longer today than I planned, but needless to say, I like talking about these things. So thanks for listening. This show exists because people like you are willing to do the work and to pursue mountains seriously, and that means a lot to me. So thanks for listening today. Go climb something. Bye. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If nothing else, you can say that you completed one thing today. All of the resources, products, and guest information that we share can be found in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. You can also find out more about me and what I'm up to at lisaclimbs.com and at alpineathletics.net. And if you enjoyed this show, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Cheers!